peace. It is moving toward a dangerous countdown. For decades, people believed that the American-led alliance system was permanent. NATO would remain united, Europe would stay protected, Russia would stay contained, China would keep rising quietly, and nuclear war would remain a nightmare from the past. But what if that belief was wrong? What if the old alliance system is not as strong as it looks? What if Europe is more dependent than powerful? What if Russia believes it is fighting for survival? What if China is watching everything and preparing for its own great confrontation? And the most terrifying question, what if nuclear war does not begin because leaders want it, but because they keep climbing the ladder of escalation, one step at a time, until nobody can climb back down? John Mearsheimer's perspective forces us to look at world politics without emotions, without slogans, and without comfortable illusions. In this lecture, we will explore why alliances are weakening, why great powers feel trapped, why Ukraine and Taiwan are not just local conflicts, and why the risk of nuclear war may be higher than most people want to admit. Because in international politics, the most dangerous wars do not always begin with madness. Sometimes, they begin with fear. And today, the great powers are afraid. Welcome to the Book Lens. The first question, what is the main idea of this lecture? Answer, the main idea is simple but deeply dangerous. The world is moving from one global order to another, and during that transition, the risk of major war becomes much higher. For decades, the United States was the dominant power. It had the strongest military, the biggest alliance network, the most influential economy, and the ability to shape global politics. After the Cold War, Washington believed it could expand its influence almost everywhere. It believed liberal democracy, NATO expansion, globalization, and American leadership could create a stable world. But from a realist perspective, that world is now breaking down. Power is shifting. China has risen. Russia has pushed back. Europe is weaker than it appears. The United States is no longer willing or able to police every region with the same confidence. The old alliance system is under pressure, and when alliances weaken, when great powers feel threatened, and when nuclear weapons are involved, the world becomes extremely dangerous. This lecture explains that danger through the realist view associated with John Mearsheimer. Question: what is realism in international politics? Answer: realism is the idea that international politics is not mainly about good intentions, morality, democracy, or friendship. It is mainly about power, survival, fear, and security. In domestic politics, there is a government above citizens. If someone attacks you, you can call the police. If someone steals from you, courts exist. But in international politics, there is no world government that can reliably protect every state. So countries must protect themselves. That is the core of realism. Realists believe that states live in an anarchic system, meaning there is no higher authority above them. Because of that, powerful countries always worry about threats. They do not simply trust promises. They look at military capability, geography, alliances, and intentions. And here is the frightening part. Even defensive moves by one side can look offensive to the other side. One country says, "We are expanding our alliance for peace." The other country hears, "Your military bloc is moving closer to my border." One side says, "We are protecting democracy." The other side says, "You are surrounding us." This is how security competition begins. Question: why does Mearsheimer focus so much on great powers? Answer: because great powers are the main actors that shape the international system. Small countries matter, but they usually do not determine the structure of world politics. Great powers do. They have large militaries, strong economies, nuclear weapons, global influence, and the ability to change the balance of power. In Mearsheimer's realist view, great powers are always trying to survive, and the best way to survive is to become as powerful as possible. A great power does not want another great power dominating its region. It does not want hostile alliances near its borders. It does not want to be encircled. This is why the United States has long cared about the Western Hemisphere. It does not want rival great powers building military alliances in Canada, Mexico, or the Caribbean. In the same way, Russia does not want NATO deeply embedded in Ukraine. China does not want U.S. military powers surrounding it in East Asia. Realism asks us to think like great powers think, not like moral commentators think. That does not mean every action by a great power is justified. It means that if we want to understand world politics, we must understand fear, power, and geography. Question: what does alliance system collapse mean? Answer: it does not necessarily mean NATO disappears tomorrow. It means the old system of alliances becomes less reliable, less united, and less effective. After World War II, the United States built a huge alliance network, NATO in Europe, alliances with Japan and South Korea in Asia, partnerships in the Middle East, security ties across the world. During the Cold War, this system was built to contain the Soviet Union. After the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States remained the center of global power. Many countries followed Washington because America looked like the only real superpower. But now the situation is changing. China has become a great power. Russia has refused to accept a Western-dominated security order in Europe. Many countries in the global South do not want to fully align with Washington. Europe wants American protection, but also fears becoming too dependent. The United States wants allies, but it also wants them to carry more of the burden. So the old alliance system is not collapsing like a building falling in 1 second. It is cracking like ice under pressure. The cracks appear in defense spending, Ukraine policy, China policy, energy policy, trade policy, and public trust. The alliance system still exists, but its unity is no longer automatic. Key question: why is the shift from unipolarity to multipolarity so dangerous? Answer: because power transitions are unstable. Unipolarity means one great power dominates the system. After the Cold War, the United States was the unipole. It had no equal rival. Multipolarity means several great powers exist at the same time. Today, the United States, China, and Russia are central actors, while other regional powers also matter more than before. In a unipolar world, one state sets many rules. In a multipolar world, several states challenge each other. That makes miscalculation more likely. Each great power begins testing limits. Each alliance becomes more important. Each border region becomes more sensitive. Each crisis becomes connected to bigger strategic competition. In this kind of world, a local war can become a global crisis. Ukraine is not only about Ukraine. It is about NATO, Russia, Europe, American credibility, and the future of the European security order. Taiwan is not only about Taiwan. It is about China, the United States, control of East Asia, military credibility, and the balance of power in the Pacific. When multipolarity returns, the world becomes more uncertain. And uncertainty is dangerous because leaders may overestimate their strength, underestimate their enemy, or believe they can control escalation when they cannot. Question: what is Mearsheimer's view of NATO expansion? Answer: Mearsheimer's view is that NATO expansion was a major strategic mistake because it ignored how Russia would interpret Western moves near its border. His argument is not that Russia is innocent or morally pure. His argument is that great powers react harshly when rival alliances move into areas they consider vital to their security. For Russia, Ukraine is not just another country. Ukraine is geographically, historically, and strategically important. It sits on Russia's border. It has deep cultural and military significance. From Moscow's perspective, if Ukraine becomes part of a hostile Western military system, that is an existential threat. Mearsheimer argued in 2014 that the West should stop trying to make Ukraine a Western outpost and instead support Ukraine as a neutral buffer state between NATO and Russia. Again, this does not mean every Russian action is justified. It means that from a realist perspective, the West should have predicted that Russia would push back. Realism is not about approving behavior. It is about understanding causes. Question: why does Ukraine matter so much in this argument? Answer: Ukraine matters because it is the place where Western expansion and Russian security fears collide. From the Western point of view, Ukraine has the right to choose its own future. Many Western leaders argue that Ukraine should be free to move toward the European Union, NATO, and the democratic world. From the Russian point of view, Ukraine becoming a Western military partner is unacceptable. Moscow sees that as NATO moving directly onto Russia's doorstep. Realism says both sides may talk about principles, but the real issue is power. The West talks about sovereignty. Russia talks about security. Ukraine talks about survival. And once war begins, every side becomes more locked into its position. The danger is that Ukraine becomes not just a battlefield, but a symbol. For the West, it becomes a test of credibility. For Russia, it becomes a test of national security. For Ukraine, it becomes a fight for existence. When a war becomes symbolic for multiple sides, compromise becomes extremely difficult. Question: how does this connect to nuclear war? Answer: the nuclear danger comes from escalation. Russia is a nuclear-armed great power. The United States is a nuclear-armed great power. NATO includes nuclear-armed states. When nuclear powers are indirectly or directly involved in the same conflict, the danger is not ordinary. Most people imagine nuclear war as a sudden decision. One leader wakes up and launches missiles. But nuclear danger usually grows through steps. First, a conventional war becomes intense. Then one side starts losing badly. Then it fears defeat. Then it believes vital interests are at stake. Then it signals nuclear warnings. Then the other side doubts whether those warnings are real. Then both sides move closer to the edge. This is the escalation ladder. Mearsheimer's concern is that if Russia believes defeat in Ukraine threatens its core security, it may consider extreme measures. Western leaders may believe Russia is bluffing. Russia may believe the West is ignoring its red lines. That is exactly how miscalculation becomes deadly. Nuclear war is unlikely in a normal situation, but in a crisis involving vital interests, fear, humiliation, battlefield losses, and alliance pressure, the risk rises. That is the danger. Question: does realism mean smaller countries have no rights? Answer: no. Realism does not say smaller countries have no rights. It says rights do not protect a country unless power supports them. A small country may have the legal right to choose alliances, but if that choice threatens a nearby great power, the great power may react violently. This is harsh, but realism is harsh. It does not describe the world as it should be. It describes the world as it often is. For example, Cuba had the right to choose its partners, but when the Soviet Union placed missiles in Cuba, the United States saw it as intolerable. Washington did not say, "Cuba is sovereign, so we accept this." It threatened war. That is how great powers behave. So in realism, the tragedy is that small countries often live in the shadow of larger powers. Their legal rights may be real, but their security depends on geography and balance of power. This is why buffer states are so important in realist thinking. A buffer state can survive if it avoids becoming a military platform for one great power against another. Question: what is a buffer state? Answer: a buffer state is a country located between rival great powers or rival blocs. Its role is to reduce direct confrontation. A neutral Ukraine, in Mearsheimer's view, could have served as a buffer between NATO and Russia. It could have had economic relations with both sides, political independence, and military neutrality. The idea is not perfect. Neutrality is difficult. It requires guarantees, discipline, and acceptance by all major players. But from a realist perspective, it is often safer than forcing a country into one military camp when it sits next to a threatened great power. The problem is that after 2014, and especially after 2022, neutrality became much harder. War radicalizes everyone. Trust disappears. The space for compromise shrinks. So the buffer state solution may have been easier before the war than after the war. That is one of the great tragedies of this crisis. Question: why does Mearsheimer criticize liberal hegemony? Answer: liberal hegemony is the idea that the United States should use its power to spread liberal democracy, expand institutions, promote human rights, and integrate countries into a Western-led order. Supporters see this as positive. They believe a world of democracies is safer. They believe NATO expansion protects smaller states. They believe Western institutions create stability. Mearsheimer disagrees. He argues that liberal hegemony often ignores nationalism, local history, and great power security concerns. It assumes other countries will accept Western leadership if Western intentions are good. But realists believe intentions are less important than capabilities. A Russian leader does not only ask, "Does NATO say it is peaceful?" He asks, "What military power is moving near our border?" A Chinese leader does not only ask, "Does America say it supports stability?" He asks, "Why are American ships, bases, and alliances surrounding China?" Liberal hegemony believes politics can be transformed. Realism believes power politics always returns. And according to this view, the West became overconfident after the Cold War. It thought history had moved in its favor forever. But history did not end. Great power competition came back. Question: why is Europe in trouble according to this perspective? Answer: Europe is in trouble because it depends heavily on the United States for security, but American priorities are changing. During the Cold War, the U.S. focused heavily on Europe because the Soviet Union was the main rival. After the Cold War, NATO expanded, and Europe remained under the American security umbrella. But today, China is the main long-term competitor for the United States. That means Washington wants to shift more attention and resources to Asia. If America focuses on China, Europe must do more for its own defense. But Europe is divided, slow-moving, and militarily dependent on the United States. This creates a strategic problem. Europe wants security from America. America wants Europe to carry more burden. Russia remains a major threat in European thinking. China pulls American attention away from Europe. This is why the alliance system feels unstable. The old assumption was, America will always be there. The new question is, what if America is distracted, divided, or unwilling? That question terrifies Europe. Question: how does Donald Trump fit into this argument? Answer in the video topic. Trump is presented as one factor accelerating the breakdown of the old alliance system, while the deeper structural factor is the shift to multipolarity and China's rise. From a realist perspective, Trump is not the original cause of the crisis. He is a symptom and an accelerator. The deeper issue is that the United States has too many commitments. It wants to contain China, support Ukraine, protect Europe, manage the Middle East, defend Asian allies, and maintain global dominance. That is expensive and difficult. Trump's approach is more transactional. He asks allies to pay more. He questions old commitments. He treats alliances less like sacred partnerships and more like deals. This shocks European elites because they built their security around American reliability. But realism says this was always a risk. If a country depends on another country for survival, it is vulnerable to that country's domestic politics. So Trump exposes something Europe did not want to face. NATO is powerful, but its center of gravity is Washington. If Washington changes, the alliance changes. Question: is NATO really collapsing? Answer: NATO is not disappearing overnight. It remains a powerful military alliance. It has expanded, added new members, and continues to support Ukraine. But collapse can mean loss of unity, loss of trust, and loss of strategic clarity. NATO faces several tensions. First, the United States wants Europe to spend more on defense. Second, Europe fears Russia, but does not have enough independent military capability. Third, different NATO members have different threat perceptions. Fourth, the Ukraine war creates a risk of escalation. Fifth, America's focus on China makes Europe worry about being downgraded. So NATO can still exist formally while becoming politically weaker. An alliance is not only a treaty, it is also trust. If members begin doubting whether the strongest member will really come to their defense, the alliance's psychological power weakens. That is why alliance credibility matters so much. Question: why is credibility so dangerous in international politics? Answer: credibility is dangerous because countries sometimes fight not only for the immediate issue, but to prove they are serious. The United States may support Ukraine not only because of Ukraine itself, but because it wants to show allies and rivals that American commitments matter. Russia may continue fighting not only because of territory, but because it wants to prove that NATO cannot defeat it in its own neighborhood. Europe may keep escalating support because it fears that if Russia wins, European security is damaged. When credibility becomes central, compromise becomes harder. No one wants to look weak. No one wants to admit failure. No one wants allies to panic. No one wants enemies to become encouraged. This is why wars can continue even when the costs are enormous. Credibility turns strategy into reputation, and reputation can become a trap. Question: what is the risk if Russia starts losing badly? Answer: the risk is escalation. If Russia believes it is losing a war that affects its vital security interests, it may look for ways to change the battlefield or shock the opponent. This could include wider attacks, mobilization, strikes on supply routes, cyber operations, or nuclear signaling. The most dangerous scenario is one where Russian leaders believe defeat would threaten regime survival or national security. In that situation, they may take risks that look irrational from the outside, but rational from their own fear-based perspective. This is one reason Mearsheimer and other realists warn about pushing nuclear powers into corners. A nuclear-armed state is most dangerous when it believes it has no acceptable way out. That does not mean the world should surrender to nuclear blackmail. But it does mean leaders must think carefully about escalation pathways. The question is not only, what is morally right? The question is also, what happens next? Question: what is the risk if the West starts losing politically in Ukraine? Answer: the West may also escalate. If Ukraine loses territory or bargaining power, Western leaders may face pressure to increase weapons deliveries, provide longer-range systems, send trainers, expand intelligence support, or consider new forms of involvement. Each step may be presented as limited, but the other side may see it as direct escalation. This is the danger of incremental involvement. One side says, this is only defensive aid. The other side says, you are becoming a combat participant. One side says, this is necessary to prevent aggression. The other side says, you are crossing a red line. Over time, the line between indirect war and direct war can become blurred. That is especially dangerous when nuclear powers are on opposite sides. Question: why does Mearsheimer often say the war is unlikely to end easily? Answer: because the war involves incompatible objectives. Ukraine wants sovereignty, territory, security, and freedom from Russian domination. Russia wants to prevent Ukraine from becoming a Western military platform and wants control or influence over key territories. The West wants Russia weakened, or at least prevented from winning. These goals clash. A simple peace deal requires compromise, but compromise is politically painful for everyone. Ukraine does not want to give up land. Russia does not want to give up its security demands. The West does not want to reward aggression. Domestic politics makes compromise even harder. Leaders fear being called weak, traitorous, or defeated. So wars like this often continue because peace requires decisions that leaders are afraid to make. That is why realists focus on the balance of power and vital interests. They believe peace becomes possible only when all sides recognize limits. Question: how does China change everything? Answer: China changes everything because it is the only country with the potential to become a peer competitor to the United States. Russia is dangerous militarily, especially because of nuclear weapons, but China is the bigger long-term strategic challenge for Washington. It has massive industrial capacity, economic scale, technological ambition, and growing military power. From a realist perspective, the United States will naturally try to contain China's rise. China will naturally try to push the United States away from its region. This creates intense competition in East Asia. Taiwan becomes central. The South China Sea becomes central. Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Australia become more important. India becomes more strategically relevant. The problem is that the United States cannot easily focus on China while also deeply involved in Ukraine, Europe, and the Middle East. This is overstretch. A great power that tries to dominate everywhere may weaken itself. Mearsheimer's realist logic would suggest that the U.S. should prioritize China and avoid unnecessary conflicts elsewhere. But American foreign policy often tries to do everything at once. That is dangerous. Question: why is Taiwan another nuclear risk flashpoint? Answer: Taiwan is dangerous because China sees it as a core national issue, while the United States sees Taiwan as strategically important for the balance of power in Asia. If China uses force against Taiwan, the United States may intervene or support Taiwan heavily. If the U.S. intervenes, there is a possibility of direct war between two nuclear-armed great powers. The danger is not only nuclear weapons at the beginning. The danger is escalation after conventional conflict begins. Suppose Chinese forces attack Taiwan. Suppose U.S. ships or aircraft become involved. Suppose one side suffers major losses. Suppose strikes expand to bases, ports, satellites, or cyber systems. At that point, leaders may fear defeat, humiliation, or strategic collapse. That is when nuclear risk becomes more real. Taiwan, like Ukraine, is not just a local issue. It is tied to the balance of power between major states. That is why it is so dangerous. Question: what does realism say about morality and foreign policy? Answer: realism does not say morality is meaningless. It says morality cannot replace strategy. A policy can sound moral, but produce disaster. A leader can speak about freedom, but provoke a war. A country can support democracy, but ignore the security fears of a nuclear power. A government can condemn aggression, but still make decisions that worsen escalation. Realism asks, what are the consequences? It is possible to be morally right and strategically reckless at the same time. This is a hard lesson. Realists believe leaders must protect national interests first, because their main responsibility is the survival of their state. If they pursue moral goals without understanding power politics, they may create more suffering. So realism is often criticized as cold. But realists would respond, ignoring power is not compassionate if it leads to war. Question: does Mearsheimer blame only the West for the Ukraine war? Answer: Mearsheimer is famous for arguing that Western policy, especially NATO expansion and the effort to bring Ukraine into the Western camp, played a major role in causing the crisis. His 2014 Foreign Affairs article argued that the West should pursue a neutral Ukraine instead of trying to westernize it. But this does not mean Russia has no agency. Russia made the decision to invade. Russia is responsible for its battlefield conduct. The realist argument is about deeper causes, not legal innocence. There is a difference between asking, who pulled the trigger, and asking, what conditions made the shooting more likely? Mearsheimer focuses on the second question. His critics say this gives too much weight to Russian security claims and too little weight to Ukrainian sovereignty. His supporters say ignoring Russian red lines was strategically foolish. The debate is intense because it touches the deepest question in international politics. Should the world be organized around legal principles or around the realities of power? Realists answer, legal principles matter, but power decides what happens when principles clash. Question: why do many people reject Mearsheimer's argument? Answer: many people reject it because they believe it sounds like blaming the victim. Ukraine was invaded. Ukraine is suffering. So when someone says Western policy helped cause the crisis, critics hear that as excusing Russia. Others reject it because they believe countries have the right to choose alliances. They argue that Russia should not have veto power over Ukraine's future. Some also believe NATO is defensive, not offensive, and therefore Russia's fear of NATO is exaggerated or dishonest. These criticisms are serious, but Mearsheimer's realist response would be that great powers do not care only about what an alliance claims to be. They care about what it can do. A military alliance near your border is not judged only by its stated purpose, it is judged by its capabilities. That is the realist point. In international politics, perception matters. If one side sees a move as threatening, that perception can drive policy, even if the other side claims peaceful intentions. Question: why is miscalculation such a big danger? Answer: miscalculation happens when leaders misunderstand the opponent. They may think the opponent is bluffing. They may think the opponent will back down. They may think their own side is more united than it really is. They may think escalation can be controlled. They may think economic sanctions will break the enemy quickly. They may think weapons deliveries will not provoke a response. They may think time is on their side. Many wars begin or continue because of wrong assumptions. Before a war, leaders often believe it will be short. During a war, leaders often believe one more push will change everything. Near escalation, leaders often believe the other side will blink first. But when both sides believe the other side will blink, disaster becomes possible. This is why nuclear crises are so terrifying. Nuclear war may not be planned. It may emerge from pressure, fear, and misreading signals. Question: what is the security dilemma? Answer: the security dilemma is when one country's attempt to make itself safer makes another country feel less safe. NATO expands to protect Eastern Europe. Russia feels threatened. Russia responds militarily. Eastern Europe feels even more threatened. NATO increases military presence. Russia feels encircled. The cycle continues. Each side says it is acting defensively. Each side sees the other as aggressive. This is one of the most important concepts in realism. The tragedy is that countries can end up in conflict even when neither side originally wanted a major war. Fear creates action. Action creates fear. Fear creates more action. Eventually, the situation becomes explosive. Ukraine is often seen by realists as a classic security dilemma, although many critics argue Russia's ambitions go beyond defensive fears. Either way, the concept helps explain why security competition can spiral. Question: what is nuclear deterrence? Answer: nuclear deterrence means preventing war by making the cost of attack unbearable. If two nuclear powers can destroy each other, neither side wants to start a nuclear war. This is why nuclear weapons can create caution. But deterrence is not perfect. It depends on rational decision-making, clear communication, secure command systems, and accurate perception. In a calm environment, deterrence can be stable. In a chaotic war, deterrence becomes more fragile. If leaders fear defeat, if warning systems malfunction, if communication breaks down, or if one side believes the other is preparing a first strike, deterrence can fail. Mearsheimer has long written about nuclear deterrence, including the controversial argument in the 1990s that Ukraine retaining a nuclear deterrent could reduce the risk of Russian aggression. That argument remains controversial, but it shows his realist logic. States with nuclear weapons are harder to coerce. Question: why does the nuclear issue make Ukraine especially tragic? Answer: Ukraine once had nuclear weapons on its territory after the Soviet Union collapsed. It later gave them up. Many people supported denuclearization because fewer nuclear states seemed better for global security. Mearsheimer took the opposite view. He argued that Ukraine without nuclear weapons would be vulnerable to Russia. His logic was that nuclear deterrence could help protect Ukraine from a stronger neighbor. Today, that argument is often discussed again because Ukraine was invaded after giving up those weapons. But the issue is complicated. Keeping nuclear weapons would have created huge diplomatic, technical, and security problems. It might have led to severe pressure from Russia and the West. It might have created other dangers. Still, the realist lesson is clear. Security guarantees are not the same as nuclear deterrence. Promises can weaken. Alliances can hesitate. But nuclear weapons change calculations. That is why nuclear politics is so central to realist theory. Question: what does Mearsheimer think the United States should do? Answer: from a realist perspective, the United States should focus on the most important threat, China. That means avoiding unnecessary wars, avoiding overstretch, and not pushing Russia and China closer together. The U.S. should not try to dominate every region at once. It should prioritize. A realist would say America made a mistake by expanding NATO and creating a confrontation with Russia, because that pushed Russia toward China. If China is the main competitor, then driving Russia into China's arms is strategically foolish. Instead, the U.S. should have tried to keep Russia neutral or even friendly enough to balance China. This is classic balance of power thinking. Do not create enemies you do not need. Do not fight on multiple fronts. Do not confuse moral ambition with strategic wisdom. The realist question is always what serves the national interest and preserves the balance of power. Question: why is the Russia-China partnership important? Answer: it is important because it changes the global balance. If Russia and China cooperate closely, the United States faces pressure in both Europe and Asia. Russia can challenge the European order. China can challenge the Asian order. Together, they create a larger anti-Western bloc. They are not identical countries. They have different interests and historical tensions. But Western pressure can push them together. Realism says countries often align not because they love each other, but because they face a common threat. If both Moscow and Beijing see Washington as the main obstacle to their ambitions, they have reason to cooperate. That is bad for U.S. strategy. A wiser American strategy, from this viewpoint, would have tried to prevent a strong Russia-China alignment. But the Ukraine war and sanctions have made Russia more dependent on China, while China benefits from Russia as a strategic partner against U.S. pressure. That is one of the biggest geopolitical consequences of the war. Question: what happens if the old American-led order ends? Answer: the world becomes more regional, more competitive, and more uncertain. The United States will remain powerful, but it will not be able to command the same obedience. China will shape Asia more strongly. Russia will continue resisting Western dominance near its borders. Middle powers like India, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and others will try to maneuver between great powers. The global south will avoid taking orders from one bloc. International institutions may become weaker because great powers will disagree more often. Trade may become more political. Technology may split into rival systems. Military competition may intensify. This does not mean global chaos is guaranteed, but it does mean the easy assumptions of the unipolar era are gone. The world will not simply follow Washington's script. That is the reality of multipolarity. Question: is multipolarity good or bad? Answer: it can be both. Some countries welcome multipolarity because they believe the U.S. led order was unfair, arrogant, or too interventionist. They want more choice and less American pressure. But multipolarity also has dangers. When multiple great powers compete, there are more chances for conflict. Alliances shift, arms races grow, border disputes become more dangerous. Regional wars can attract outside powers. A unipolar world can be arrogant. A multipolar world can be unstable. Realists do not romanticize multipolarity. They see it as natural, but risky. The safest world is not necessarily one with many powers. It is one where great powers clearly understand each other's red lines and avoid reckless expansion. The problem today is that red lines are contested. Russia has red lines in Ukraine. China has red lines over Taiwan. The U.S. has red lines about alliance credibility and regional dominance. When red lines overlap, crisis becomes likely. Question: what is the most dangerous mistake leaders can make? Answer: the most dangerous mistake is believing that the other side will not act because its action would be costly. Before many wars, leaders say they would never do that. It would hurt them too much. But states sometimes accept huge costs when they believe vital interests are at stake. Russia accepted sanctions, isolation, and military losses because it believed Ukraine's Western alignment was unacceptable. China may accept huge costs over Taiwan if it believes national unity and regime legitimacy are at stake. The United States may accept major risks to preserve alliance credibility and prevent rival dominance. Great powers do not always behave like profit-maximizing businesses. They behave like security-seeking states. They may sacrifice wealth for strategic position. They may sacrifice comfort for prestige. They may sacrifice peace for what they define as survival. This is why underestimating resolve is so dangerous. Question: how could nuclear war actually happen? Answer: it could happen through escalation, not necessarily through a planned first strike. Imagine a conventional war where one side begins losing. The losing side uses stronger weapons. The other side responds. Military targets expand. Command centers are threatened. Cyber attacks hit early warning systems. Satellites are disabled. Leaders fear a decapitation strike. Nuclear forces are placed on alert. One side uses a small nuclear weapon to signal seriousness. The other side feels forced to respond. At that point, control becomes extremely difficult. The world has never fought a prolonged direct war between nuclear great powers. So no one truly knows where the limit is. That uncertainty is terrifying. Nuclear war may be unlikely, but the consequences are so catastrophic that even a small risk matters. This is why realists warn against playing with escalation. Question: what is the role of fear in great power politics? Answer: fear is central. Countries fear invasion. They fear encirclement. They fear losing influence. They fear hostile alliances. They fear technological inferiority. They fear regime collapse. They fear humiliation. They fear being left alone. Fear makes states aggressive even when they claim to be defensive. A fearful state may attack first because it believes waiting is more dangerous. A fearful alliance may expand because it believes expansion creates safety. A fearful rival may see expansion as a threat and respond violently. Fear is not always rational, but it is always powerful. Realism takes fear seriously because in a world without a global police force, fear never disappears. Question: why are leaders trapped by domestic politics? Answer: leaders cannot make foreign policy in a vacuum. They must answer to domestic audiences, political rivals, media, elites, and public opinion. If a leader compromises, opponents may call him weak. If a leader retreats, nationalists may call him a traitor. If a leader escalates, he may look strong at home, but increase international danger. In wartime, domestic politics becomes even more emotional. Deaths must be justified. Sacrifices must be given meaning. Propaganda hardens public opinion. Negotiation becomes politically toxic. This is why ending wars is often harder than starting them. Even if leaders privately know compromise is necessary, they may fear the domestic cost. Realism focuses on international power, but domestic politics can make international conflict more rigid. Question: what would a realist peace in Ukraine look like? Answer: a realist peace would likely involve neutrality, territorial compromise, security guarantees, and recognition that neither side can get everything it wants. Ukraine would need security. Russia would need assurance that Ukraine will not become a NATO military platform. The West would need a settlement that avoids total humiliation. This is extremely difficult because the war has produced anger, destruction, and distrust. But a realist would argue that peace cannot be built on fantasies. It must be built on the balance of power. If one side cannot fully defeat the other, negotiation eventually becomes necessary. The tragedy is that the longer the war continues, the more people die, and the harder compromise becomes. Realist peace is not about justice in a perfect sense. It is about stopping the killing and preventing wider war. That is why many people find realism uncomfortable. It often demands ugly compromises. Question: what is the strongest criticism of the realist position? Answer: the strongest criticism is that realism may reward aggression. Critics say if Russia invades Ukraine and then receives concessions, other powers may learn that force works. They also argue that Ukraine's sovereignty should not be sacrificed because Russia feels insecure. This criticism matters. If international politics becomes only about spheres of influence, small states suffer. But realists respond that small states already suffer when great power competition is ignored. They argue that promising Ukraine NATO membership without being ready to fight Russia directly created a dangerous illusion. In other words, critics say realism is morally dangerous. Realists say liberal idealism is strategically dangerous. This debate has no easy answer, but any serious analysis must face both sides. Question: why does this lecture matter for ordinary people? Answer: because great power politics does not remain inside government offices. It affects fuel prices, food prices, migration, military budgets, inflation, trade, technology, and the risk of war. When alliances break down, countries spend more on weapons. When wars expand, energy prices rise. When sanctions increase, markets shift. When nuclear threats rise, global fear increases. Ordinary people may not follow every diplomatic meeting, but they live with the consequences. A war in Ukraine affects families in Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East through food, energy, and inflation. A conflict over Taiwan could affect global technology supply chains. A breakdown of U.S.-China trade could reshape jobs and prices worldwide. So this topic is not only for experts. It is about the future ordinary people will live in. Question: what is the final warning? Answer: the final warning is that the world is entering a period where old rules are weakening and new rules have not yet stabilized. That is the most dangerous moment in international politics. The United States still wants to lead. China wants more regional power. Russia wants a sphere of security. Europe wants protection, but lacks unity. Ukraine fights for survival. Taiwan sits at the center of U.S.-China rivalry. Alliances are under pressure. Nuclear weapons sit behind every major crisis. This does not mean nuclear war is certain. It does not mean world war is inevitable. But it does mean leaders must be extremely careful. The realist message is not romantic. It is not emotional. It is not comforting. It says, power matters. Geography matters. Fear matters. Red lines matter. And when nuclear powers collide, moral confidence is not enough. The world needs restraint, diplomacy, balance, and a clear understanding of what each great power considers vital. Because the greatest danger is not that leaders want nuclear war. The greatest danger is that they believe they can keep escalating without reaching it. And history shows that once a crisis begins moving faster than leaders can control, even powerful states can become prisoners of their own decisions. So the question is not only whether alliances are collapsing. The real question is this: can the world adjust to a new balance of power without destroying itself? That is the central question of our time.